Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this policy dialogue on the plastics challenge. What can the EU do? Organized by the European Policy Center and supported by the European Investment Bank. My name is Stefan. I'm a policy analyst at DPC, and I will be moderating this event. And so today we will discuss, talk about plastics, namely about the challenges associated with plastics in terms of its climate, environmental impacts. We'll discuss what can be done by the EU and also by the industry to overcome the plastics challenge and move towards greater sustainability. We will also look at the impacts of the Russian invasion on Ukraine on the plastic sector and these efforts to move towards greater sustainability. So yeah, we will try to cover different angles. This is a big topic and you can approach it from different sides, but hopefully we will then manage to do as much as we can in terms of discussing this challenge and ways to overcome it. And we have a panel of 4 speakers today to discuss the matter, followed by 2 respondents, and we will hear their interventions first. But I would like to encourage the participants to write their questions as soon as they can, so that we can then take as many questions as possible in the Q&A session. Without then any further ado, I would like to start with Tobias Nielsen, expert, Sustainable Resource Use and Industry, European Environment Agency. Tobias, thanks for joining us, and then happy to hear from you, say, the overview of the plastics challenge, the current and possible environmental and climate impacts of plastics. And of course, then we can discuss further on any additional topics. Please, the floor is yours.
Okay, Stefan, thank you very much. And thank you very much for having me. So I will try to outline some of the key challenges of plastic, the environmental challenge and the climate challenges. I'm not sure if, Natalie, if you can share my screen. Yes, perfect. I'll dive straight into it. So already the next slide. So I think when we talk about the challenges, a key part of the story can be summed up in these 2 figures. So the plastic production has increased rapidly in the past decades. In 1950, when sort of the plastic story really began, there were around 2 million tons of plastic produced globally. In 2019, there was around 460 million tons of plastic produced, and this trajectory is likely to continue. And so we'll probably produce over 1 billion tons of plastic in 2050. Half of all the plastic that has ever been produced has been produced since 2000. And this is a particular issue or concern or challenge because we're not really good at dealing with the end of life of plastic. So if you can see on the other figure, this is a global stats from freshly produced by the OECD, which indicates that close to half of all plastic waste is landfilled. Another quarter is mismanaged, so open pit burning and so on, which means that a huge amount, 2/3 of plastic is, you can say, is mismanaged or will eventually leak into nature. And 17% is incinerated. So the EU figures are somewhat better. I think around 40% is incinerated in the EU, not 50%, but around 1/3 is sent to recycling. Although a recent report by Material Economics points to that the recycling rates are much lower than previously thought of. So there might be as low as 15% and not 30%, which is sort of the conventional wisdom on the recycling rate of plastic in Europe. If we move to the next slide, we can see that the EU, we can't really export our way out of this either. China imported, so previously we exported a lot of our plastic waste to especially China, but they introduced a ban on low quality plastics in 2017, which means that our export, the EU export to China of low quality plastic sort of dropped rapidly, as you can see from this figure. So this is really an issue that we have to deal with ourselves. We can't export our way out of this. We move to the next slide, please. The consumption, what's driving this sort of fast rate of fast increase in plastic production is, so you can see we have a very high consumption of plastics in the EU. We have around 150 kilos per capita per year, which is much higher than sort of non-OECD countries. So that also explains why the sort of the trajectory is so steep and will continue. So according to the OECD, plastic consumption is very much related to our GDP. So as the rest of the world sort of develops, so will their plastic consumption. So we really need to deal with this issue. A lot of the plastic consumption is short-lived products. So packaging is typically the biggest use of plastics. Again, on this diagram by the OECD, this is perhaps slightly different than what we're used to seeing for the European consumption, because this one includes textiles as well, which is often left out. But here we can see that a huge part of the plastic consumption is short-lived products, which again adds to the whole waste management issue. If we go on to the next slide, but again, the challenges of plastic are not just pollution. If we look, we need to look at the whole life cycle of plastic to really understand the different challenges, different types of challenges when we talk about plastic. So if we look at the sort of the beginning of the life cycle and the extraction and production phase, we can see that this is based 99% of plastics today are based on fossil fuels, and around 3 to 4% of global greenhouse gas emissions come from plastic production and incineration. The vast majority, though, is production. We also have a lot of pollutants that leak out from plastic production. So there's an area in the US that's called Cancer Alley, where there's a high concentration of petrochemical plants, which then leak different types of toxic chemicals, causing an above normal rate of cancer in that area. Toxicity, so it's also another issue, and we sort of get exposed to some of these toxic substances through our use of plastics. So there's a study recently that argued that we take in around 100,000 particles of plastic a year through through our use, through sort of when we eat stuff that has been packaged in plastic, but also breathing in microplastic particles which are in the air. And although sort of the risks of this are still sort of there's a high level of uncertainty, you can say, between the exact risk of this, but there are a couple of smoking guns. So we can see that early puberty, lower, what do you call, sorry, I forgot, lower reproductive and also some neurodevelopment disorders are somehow linked to our increased exposure to chemicals. Plastic pollution is, of course, the one that gathers the most attention, one of the things we often most frequently talk about. And again, there we can see there's a huge amount of plastic that leaks into the environment. The latest figures point to around 22 million tons of plastic that leak into the environment every year, both in the ocean but also on land. So these are some of the key sort of challenges. And if you go to the next slide, we can see that if we don't really manage these, now the problems or the challenges will only get worse as we go forward. So on the figure to the left, we can see that although only 3 to 4% of the greenhouse gas emissions are related to plastic as it is now, if sort of the trajectory continues, 10 to 13% of our 1.5 degree carbon budget will be on plastics production alone. And you can say plastic is also one of the key sort of areas of interest for the oil and gas sector, as our consumption of transport will decrease as we get more EVs on the road. The future for a lot of the oil and gas companies will be in plastic, as there's sort of more demand for this, and there's also more profit in plastics. On the right, we can see a recent study which picks up on this planetary boundary. So it's arguing that new entities, most of that is chemicals and plastic, has already far exceeding the safe operating space for our planet. So that in that study, they argue that the current production and sort of levels of pollution far exceed our ability to assess and monitor the problem. So for their perspective, we're far exceeding the planetary boundary of, you can say, of plastics. And I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tobias, for this very good and concise overview of the scale of the challenge we are facing, and yeah, the climate impacts, the pollution, the health hazards posed by plastics, and also the fact that we are not doing enough in the end of life phase to retain this material once already used, and the fact that we consume more plastics than a global average also points out that definitely more needs to be done by the EU, and that it's also linked to a global challenge to plastics. So thanks a lot, and of course happy to come back to some of these points later in discussion. Now I would like to give the floor to Emmanuelle Maire, Head of Unit Circular Economy, Sustainable Production and Consumption from DG Environment, European Commission. Happy to have you here, Emmanuelle. And yes, building on what Tobias mentioned, happy to hear about, let's say, EU's current and upcoming policies to help tackle the plastics challenge.
Thank you very much, Stefan, and good afternoon to everyone. So I think that Tobias has very well identified the big challenges we are confronted with regarding plastics. I think it's nevertheless very important to always recall that they are an important material in our economy, and that we are not against plastic. But what we want to do is to tackle the negative environmental and health impacts of plastics. So I'll take it from a policy overview. I mean, it's, I guess, known by many of you that the plastics challenge was highlighted back in 2018 with the plastics strategy. And it's important to recall the main policy goals. First of all, to improve the economics and quality of plastic recycling, curbing plastic waste and littering, including microplastics and single-use plastics, and also biodegradable plastics, driving investments and innovation in the value chain, and back in 2018 also calling for global action to reduce the plastics pollution. And obviously the European Green Deal reinforced this plastics strategy, and with the new Circular Economy Action Plan also endorsed the commitments, while giving us a new impetus also on certain files. So for example, packaging, which is a very, very important use of plastics, but also bio-based plastics or microplastics. So there is a very demanding agenda at European Union level. And if we will go into more discussions, but I would like to highlight some of the important deliverables. I mean, first of all, the results of the United Nations Environmental Assembly back in February, because I think that we have already reached an important milestone with the international partners, because UNEA 5 gave its green light to the negotiation of a legally binding treaty on plastics, obviously covering marine litter, but not only marine litter. So this recognition that we need to approach plastics from a life cycle perspective with a huge buy-in from the international community, I think is a major achievement. Obviously, it's not the end of the road. There will be a lot of work to, first of all, nominate the intergovernmental negotiating team for this plastic treaty, and then negotiate the treaty, looking at what measures should be proposed, legally binding or voluntary measures as well. So I think this is already an achievement, but again, there is a lot of work from this year to 2024, which is corresponding to the mandate of the intergovernmental panel. Then what is very important is to implement what has been already agreed in terms of European Union legislation. Already over the past mandate, there has been ambitious revision of the waste framework directive, for example, to ban landfill, and also ambitious mandates in the existing packaging and packaging waste directive to really increase the recycled plastics. So we see that the recycling rates are getting better, but still, I mean, there is a need for enforcement to meet already the targets in terms of waste management and recycling. Also on what is very important on our agenda, it's making sure that we increase the recycled content in different products on plastics. So to give a boost to the recycled plastics, there the industry has been doing a lot of work in the context of the Circular Plastics Alliance, committing to produce and uptake 10 million tons of recycled plastics in new products, but it will remain very important to place targets in specific legislation to drive the uptake of recycled content. So tomorrow there will be also new proposals on the new eco-design for sustainable product, but also in the revision of the construction product regulation. We have seen from Tobias that construction is an important use of plastics. And for now, the construction product regulation doesn't deal with the environmental impact. So this should open new ways of progressing. An obvious also demanding area of work is the revision of the packaging and packaging waste directive, where we aim to make all packaging recyclable and reusable by 2030 in an economically viable manner. So this is also extremely important. Plus, the work we are doing on microplastics, both microplastics added to products. So for example, in cosmetics or in paints, but also microplastics which are released through the use of products like textiles, but also pellets, tires, paints. We discover also new sources. So how do we deal with these microplastics? This is a subject of an ongoing public consultation. And finally, but there are many more issues to tackle together, I would like to highlight the question of bio-based, biodegradable and compostable plastics, because sometimes these magical bioplastics are seen as a solution to fossil fuel plastics. But we know that there are a number of challenges associated to biodegradable, bio-based and compostable plastics. So we are working on a communication for July to set the policy outlook as to what we should avoid and what we should promote in this context. I will stop there. Obviously, very happy to engage, but it's to give you an idea of where we started and where we are now, and there is a lot to be done. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emmanuelle, also for, say, painting this a broader picture on all the policies on plastics, as indeed packaging is maybe the biggest share of all the plastics, but there are many more, and it's really a complex policy toolbox to address plastics as a whole, and that's also what we hope to discuss today to just be aware of the scale of the challenge, that it's very much also about packaging, but there are other sectors to keep in mind. And also, notwithstanding, indeed, as you mentioned, that that there is a function for plastics in our modern economy. It's not a surprise that it is being used widely, but the challenge is, of course, to align it with our ongoing green transition, the conventional plastics, and also alternatives to conventional plastics. So thanks, and of course, a lot of files open. Hopefully we will manage to discuss some of them more in detail afterwards. But then moving on, I would be happy to hear from more like from the financial aspect, the investment angle when it comes to tackling the plastics challenge, namely from Paulina. Paulina Brzezicka, finance advisor at Innovation Finance Advisory, European Investment Bank. And yes, Paulina, happy to hear about your reflections about this. What on let's say what the EIB, namely what is doing in terms of investing in overcoming the plastics challenge, and any additional reflections you may have on this topic.
Thank you, Stefan, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Paulina Brzezicka, and indeed I work in Innovation Finance Advisory at the European Investment Bank. I have prepared a few slides, which I will try to share. Just if you could please let me know if you can see them. Are they visible?
Yes, we see them. But if you click from beginning in the upper left corner, we can see the full screen. Yeah, exactly. I think
is
then
it okay?
It is still we see the slides, but anyways, I think they're visible enough. We see them, so you can continue also in that way. If it doesn't work, yeah, that should be the button.
This is the best I can do.
Yeah. Okay, no, it's fine.
So let's move ahead. Just very briefly, I think most of you know the European Investment Bank, and indeed we are the European Climate Bank and also the world's largest multilateral lender. The EIB does lending along 4 priority lines. Of course, the environment, but we also finance innovation, infrastructure, and SMEs. And we have set ourselves extremely ambitious climate objectives. So 1 trillion euros of investment in climate action and environmental sustainability by 2030. Now, we are not only providing finance. The bank also provides lending, and advisory services. And as part of these advisory services, our task is to zoom in on critical areas of high priority for the European Union to develop recommendations and potentially new financial instruments in order to address identified funding gaps. We have now been working specifically on this problem of plastics. I have been engaged in a market study zooming in on the value chain of plastics, and I wanted to share with you some preliminary findings. So just important to note that the study is still ongoing, and this is why I'm very happy to be here today participating in this policy dialogue as we are still framing the recommendations. I think a lot of the points mentioned here about the scale of the problem have already been mentioned by Tobias. So just a very quick recap what we have identified as the key issues. So of course, the amount of plastic waste that is generated annually being 250 million tons, and 30% of that ending up in the natural environment. Specifically, a problem also concerning the oceans. We can compare the amount of plastic waste entering the oceans to dumping the contents of 1 garbage truck into the ocean every minute. So it's quite frightening when we think about it this way. The other key identified issues are that very few plastics are actually still derived from recycled materials. So it's only around 7 to 10%, and only 14% of the plastic packaging globally is collected for recycling. Now, the problem indeed seems to be quite concentrated because a lot of the plastic waste can be traced back to packaging as well as the construction sector. And also in terms of the plastics producers, the industry is quite concentrated. So a third of all plastics produced globally can be traced back to just a few companies. Now, the EIB is already looking at this problem. We have published an Oceans Plastics Reduction Guide, which you can see the link to here on the slide, which is already public. And we are working now on the value chain analysis, from which we hope to also have some more specific recommendations on potential financing instruments. So a few more findings. Geographically speaking, the problem is also very concentrated. I think it's quite well known that both the plastic waste generation and the plastic production itself can be traced back to a large extent to the Asian continent. But Europe and North America, of course, has also quite significant shares.
Paulina, sorry, just one question. If you are pointing to the slides, I think we are still on the first slide.
You are?
Yes, actually, because now we see other slides. Yeah.
Okay.
But
Thank
if
you.
Yeah, just to note. But anyways, we can share them later with the participants. But if it helps with the presentation, just to know that now we see the third slide. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let's move ahead. I think I only have a few minutes left. So zooming in now geographically, we can also see quite some visible differences within Europe and within the European Union in terms of recycling volumes, and specifically Central, Eastern Europe and Southern Europe do seem to have much lower recycling volumes, which is quite important also when it comes to designing financial instruments and reviewing where to invest in terms of additional recycling capacity or innovation. So what we did now during this value chain analysis, actually, we have conducted 29 interviews with experts from along the value chain. So 10 industrial actors, 7 financial institutions, 9 knowledge institutions and organizations active in the field of plastics. And this is just a quick overview of what has been identified as the key issues in the plastics value chain. And we have found that there are 10 key root causes of inefficiencies. Now, very important to mention that literally every interviewee from those 29 experts mentioned that, of course, the key issue in the plastics value chain is that virgin material is very affordable, while recycled has some economic disadvantages compared to virgin material. Now, the other causes of inefficiencies that the experts we interviewed pointed to were specifically mentioned by 73% of the interviewees, the design requirements of retailers and brand owners. So the fact that often plastics packaging is maybe coming in different colors and different sizes. It's not uniform, like, for example, the PET bottles, which makes the recycling much more difficult. And the second and the third key root cause identified was effectively the presence, the capacity, and the standards of the recycling and the sorting sectors, which the interviewees pointed to that it's still not sufficient and we need additional recycling capacity, innovative recycling capacity, and much enforced sorting capacity as well. And finally, the other points were the quality of the recycled material, which is still considered not high enough, the product variety of the existing plastics, as well as quality standards of industry, improper collection systems, and limited or separate collection of non-packaging plastics. So this was just a very key, very brief introduction to what we have looked at so far. And indeed, we are right now developing an action plan and recommendations specifically to address these identified challenges. I was hoping to be able to share more today, but the study is still ongoing. So I'm coming today to this panel with those preliminary findings and the recommendations being still very much in the shaping phase. So I'm looking forward to an interesting discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paulina. And of course, then looking forward to the final, let's say, findings that can then, of course, feed into the further policy making and much needed, I would say, also investments to help achieve greater sustainability also in the plastic sector. But we heard from the EU policymakers, and happy to then hear also from the civil society sector. And we have here with us Delphine, Lévi, Alvarès, coordinator of Break Free from Plastic Europe and Rethink Plastic Alliance, Zero Waste Europe. And yes, Delphine, happy to hear from you on the measures needed in your view to overcome the plastics challenge.
Thank you, Stefan. Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for the previous interventions, especially Paulina. That was very interesting to hear about the research, especially because one thing that is clearly needed is measures to direct the investments towards the solutions and away from the false solutions. So when the investment bank and also the work that has been done on the taxonomy are talking about plastic, that's actually quite interesting. Especially when it goes in the right direction, which is not always the case in the taxonomy. There is a few points that are not really helpful, especially on bio-based and biodegradable plastic. But overall, I would say that, as Emmanuelle was pointing, we have made a lot of progress in the last 5 to 6 years. Rethink Plastic is 6 years old almost. We were born at the time where the strategy on plastic was not even a thing yet, was just a discussion. And we have seen a lot of things evolving. I think we're going in the right direction, but there is a lot more to do. And there is a lot more to think about because it's a complex issue. Just preparing for that, we could go in all directions and hold the floor for about 3 hours if we wanted to cover actually the measures that are needed. What I would say is, because I've heard a lot about recycling still today, even though recycling has its space in the circular economy, it is not the solution. We are really looking at redesign and prevention in the first place and developing reuse systems. And I will insist on systems because very often we see a thinking about material substitution or changing the products, but very rarely about changing the systems. And there are no sustainable products, there are only sustainable systems. You can have a very sustainably sourced product, but if there is no system to take that in charge for the end of life, there is no point. The same way a lot of people are turning to bio-based and biodegradable in a context where you don't have a collection for this to be composted if it's compostable. So a lot of the things has to be thought of as a system redesign more than just a product or material redesign. And in that context, we're also quite concerned about this very strong push for recycled content, as long as we're not really focusing on detoxifying the circular economy at source, meaning preventing toxic chemicals to be put in products and also having a full transparent traceability of these chemicals all along the value chain, because then you end up having them in the waste that is collected for recycling, and the recycled content goes back into products containing then chemicals that are not meant to be in the first place in these products. There were studies about flame retardants, for example, found in toys or grooming products made of recycled plastic. We don't want to see that happening. So toxicity is a key element to think about and regulate on if you want to build trust in a recycled material market. So that's really something that is very important. But as I said, for us, it's the focus is on preventing production first, and then redesigning our system so that we go into a lot more reuse. And for that, we need to build adequate systems. So we're really hoping that through the packaging waste directive, there's going to be ambitious targets, but also really strong measures around standardized packaging. Because if we want to be able to circulate reusable packaging in a context that is environmentally sound, meaning not over very, very long distances, we need to make sure that there is work being done on standardized packaging. Because at the end of the day, you all have talked a lot about the impact at the end of life, and I was very happy to hear Tobias talking about Cancer Alley, not because I'm happy that Cancer Alley exists, but I think it's very important when we talk about plastic and the impacts on the environment that we stop mostly focusing on the end of life, but really look at the beginning of the life of plastic. Because plastic is not born on shelves of supermarkets. It's born in the wells where we extract oil and gas, mostly in the majority at the moment. And this is creating massive pollutions. And this is also done in a very challenging social environmental context where mostly it's communities of colors, immigrants, and unemployed people that are seeing those plants coming into their neighborhood and starting to employ people, but also massively polluting the air, the water, the soil. And if you want to have live testimonies from that, you can look at the Goldman Prize of 2021, Miss Sharon Lévi. She is explaining the impact of petrochemicals production in her hometown. And we have, and I put it in the Q&A, a toxictour.org website where you can hear testimonies from impacted communities. And it's happening far away, but it's also happening very close. At the moment, right now, today, we have some of our members, Surfrider, leading a noodle hunt just in Oncocine, like really close to here, 50 kilometers away from Brussels, collecting plastic pellets. So that's not the end of life, that's the production stage. That's leaking that pre-production pellets into the environment and creating microplastic pollution there. So there is impact all along the value chain. And for us, it's really important that we look at production as well. When we talk about plastic, we think about the packaging, or we think about any other waste treatment options, but we need to start regulating production. We have been talking about a tax on virgin plastic for a long time, for example, still hasn't happened. It has been put on non-recycled plastic waste, and it's not even a tax, it's a own contribution. But when we talk about the Green Deal and measures, for example, on ETS or on the carbon border adjustment mechanism, petrochemicals are not covered at the moment. Bulk chemicals are not, and we're not covering the whole value chain. So meaning that emissions that are happening in the petrochemicals, yeah, I would say almost empires, because I've seen that with my own eyes, and it's huge in Louisiana or in Texas or in Pennsylvania and many, many other places in the world are not accounted in the emissions that we are importing. So we also need to think about plastic as oil and gas. And when we talk about climate and impact of plastic on climate, it's not only about this LCA that's going to show you with numbers that I'm still to be seen that packaging, single-use packaging are more environmental friendly than glass, for example. It's looking at the impact of petrochemicals production, at the transport of that, because this is all coming by ship from all over the world. And by also the actual production, because oil and gas is one thing, but also the Chinese and other countries are looking at producing plastic from coal. So we are still using massively fossil fuel to produce plastic, and that's a big, big part. And we've been talking a lot about environmental impacts, I said, but social impacts are really huge. And also the social impact of any measures we are taking, we need to have around the table the ones that are using single-use plastic today and understanding what are their challenges, for example. We are in conversations, for example, with the European Disability Forum about our reuse proposals, because you need to have a deposit return system and reuse and systems for reusable packaging that are adapted to people with disability, for example. We need to think about how do we make affordable those systems for everybody, because then that's going to be the only way to actually operate a transition. And to make reusable alternatives affordable, we need to internalize the externalities of virgin plastic production and of single-use plastic, because today it's still very cheap to produce single-use plastic. That's why we have so much. And one of the drivers for that has been the expansion of the fracking industry in the US that has been massively creating availability of cheap feedstock for petrochemicals and plastic. And it's not a surprise that half of the plastic that was ever put on the market has been put on the market since the early years 2000, because that's when the fracking boom happened in the US, and that has created a lot of availability, as I said. So it's a very complex issue, and I think the money and the economic angle is a really important one that we need to discuss more, because today there's still a lot of direct or indirect subsidies to fossil fuel, a lot of direct or indirect subsidies to the petrochemicals industry, especially through the EU ETS. You've seen the work of Carbon Market Watch that is showing how actually the industry is not only not paying for the EU ETS, but also benefiting, making money, profit out of out of setting the credits. So there is a lot of things to do at the upstream level to divest the money from the production towards developing and financing the development of reuse systems. And also when we look at waste management, really looking into innovative solutions that are asking the right questions and not putting the money to develop silver bullet technologies like chemical recycling, because we don't want to do the work and put the effort that needs to be put to actually redesign the products and think about the collection much better, think about the traceability of chemicals in products to avoid to have to develop technologies that we're not even sure if they work, and they're not going to help us change the system. They're just going to put a patch on an open wound, and that's not what we need. We need to close the tap. We need to redesign our systems and see where we use plastic, in which context, and how toxic it is. Because plastic has its space in the economy for sure. We just need to use it for the right thing and make sure it's not toxic. So there are a lot of questions, but I'm just gonna really finish and insisting again on the need to consider the social impacts and the health impacts. There is a recent studies showing that about 70% of people have plastic particles in their blood. That travels in your organs. If it does the same thing as it does in the ocean, it attracts chemicals and then concentrates that and bring that to your organs. So impacts are still to be shown, but they are there and the science is here. So we need to apply a precautionary principle and put all the brain capacity and investments into the solutions rather than just trying to divert the attention and develop false solutions, putting again patches on open wounds. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Delphine, for your reflections on this, and also highlighting the importance of this, keeping in mind the entire picture and the entire value chain of plastics. And indeed that if you want to achieve greater sustainability as well as circularity, we need to consider what comes before recycling, and a lot to be done indeed in terms of designing, in terms of reusing plastics, keeping it in our economy, the plastics we already produce, before we actually move on to considering other options in the end of life phase, such as recycling. And indeed, we need to look at it as a system and look at different solutions, from logistics to other tools to help us in this transition. And of course, lots of topics, and happy to come back to some of them. Thank you. And now I would like to hear from our two respondents. And I would like to give the floor to Carolina Gregoria, Policy and Advocacy Strategy Director, Packaging and Specialty Plastics for the European, Middle East and African region, or DAO. And yeah, to hear, the industry's take on the matter, building on what you already heard from the EU, from the civil society, your views on the plastics challenge and what we can do now and in the future to overcome it.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for all the panelists for the different interventions. I think we are all agreeing on the plastics role that plays in the society. You know, I hear this from several ones, right? Especially we become more specific here about the scope 3. So the value in use that plastic has versus alternative materials in different applications, packaging, construction, automotive, to deliver CO2 savings while using against other materials. So we concretely having some examples here. We all, might be reading, some scientific-based evidences and articles about, for example, the reduction of fuel consumption if a plastic is used in an automotive, right, versus other materials. And this is as well have an impact in the climate change that we try to attack and combat. But we all agree as well, and we are as well acknowledge and agree that plastic waste and environmental degradation and climate change are existential global threats. And we are addressing those issues. So the plastics industry is actively working to advance plastic circularity and carbon neutrality all at the same time. And those are complex issues. There is no single bullet solution. I hear this as well by my colleagues, and I fully agree to address those complex global issues. So many things need to happen. So let me put some concrete examples how the plastics industry is addressing both plastic circularity and carbon neutrality. To start with plastic circularity, we have been working in the past years very intensively with value chain partners to develop new polymers which are compatible for recyclability and are able to substitute multi-material complex structures into monomaterial recyclable structures. This was developed with science-based polymers in combination with different novel art extrusion technologies that have been developed globally in the past years. This is possible. This is a commercial reality, because if we don't start designing with the end in mind of end of life, and I fully agree with the comments, we cannot make something recyclable. It has not been designed to be recycled. This is the beginning of the journey. The second is we are investing in scaling up mechanical recycling capacities in Europe. We are as well investing to scale up chemical recycling capabilities in Europe, complementing the mechanical recycling capabilities so on top of. We announced later last year, Plastics Europe, one of the trade associations representing the industry, a collective action altogether here in the plastics industry to invest 7.2 billion euros by 2030 to scale up those non-existing novel technologies, proven but not industrial scale up yet. This is very important because the complementarity of mechanical recycling and chemical recycling will enable us to be able to incorporate recycled content across different applications, from not food contact compliant applications, packaging, automotive, construction, to food contact compliant applications, not only food packaging, but others, like for example, pipes for drinking waters. So across all the portfolio of applications. So let me also put how we are addressing carbon neutrality, which is the other topic it was raised as well, because two things that need to happen at the same time. The plastics industry is investing to scale up novel technologies to be able to produce plastics differently, to produce plastics having less impact scope 1 in the carbon footprint emissions. This is all about blue hydrogen, scale up those technologies. This is scaling up carbon capture and utilization technologies. This is all about scaling up novel electric cracking technologies. Dow has announced a partnership with Shell 2 years ago to scale up those novel electric cracking technologies. When this is going to be possible at the scale in years to come, we'll be able then to utilize and power those crackers, not anymore from fossil fuels, which we want to reduce the dependence, but from renewable sources that we are hoping they will be becoming more abundant in Europe based on policy drivers from the energy directive perspective. All this is happening, but it's complex. It's not one thing. is taking time, but we are on it. We are working on it. What else on carbon neutrality? I think somebody was mentioning that we are working to reduce our dependencies on fossil fuels, fossil feedstocks. We are exploring alternative sustainable feedstocks, like for example, bio-based feedstocks, and we are exploring as well circular feedstocks, so plastic waste utilization as a new feedstock in our production plants. So with all that, let me finish with, we are embracing a lot what Emmanuelle just shared before, the policies that European Union is leading, not only the PPWD, we are embracing a constructive dialogue with you and of course, civil society along the new policies that are going to be reviewed this year from construction, CPR and automotive ELV to incorporate recycled content mandates, because this is going to incentivize those investments that are so much needed in the circularity. We want to see those recyclability definitions to come in policy to make clear that this is transparent, communicate to customers. We are embracing as well minimum criteria for design for recyclability guidelines. All this is going to be fostering the circularity to be happening. Of course, we are asking for an harmonized, consistent regulatory framework to support all the investments that the industry is committed and is doing, as I explained. We want to call as well for a technologically neutral principle adherence. And we want to call for science-based and data-driven policy. So with that, in my short response, we are agreeing we have an issue. We are working to solve those two issues at the same time. The circularity, which is the faster and more affordable enabler for carbon neutrality, but we are as well investing in putting other options to address the carbon neutrality this industry is committed for. And we are looking forward to engage with all of you and also in the Q&A section to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for Corina, for your reflections on the matter, and indeed that there is work ongoing also from your side to actually adopt novel technologies, and also we received a question also on the question of chemical recycling. As you mentioned, it's interesting to see its role because indeed we should try to prevent plastics waste from happening and try to reuse it, but also we need to work on different fronts and try to improve our recycling techniques, and using different tools in this sense can help potentially, but we need to discuss different effects, and happy to then come back to the question of chemical recycling in particular in further discussion, and also other points you mentioned. And last but not the least, we discussed mostly conventional plastics today, but we also reflected to some extent on the alternatives to the conventional plastics. And but then happy for also to elaborate upon this further, and to hear from, in that sense, to hear from Maria Negut, Head of EU Affairs, European Bioplastics, on these alternatives and how they fit into this, let's say, overall green transition when it comes to our plastic sector in particular.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much for the invitation, for the introduction. Indeed, the term bio-based was already mentioned by previous speakers today, and I'm representing European Bioplastics. We are the association representing the interests of the producers, the converters, and also the retailers of bioplastics. For those of you, however, not yet familiar with the term bioplastics, according to our definition, bioplastics are bio-based, biodegradable, or both. Bio-based means that they're at least partially made from renewable resources, and biodegradable, if no further details are given, means industrially compostable. Bioplastics are plastics materials produced, as I mentioned, from renewable biomass sources, such as vegetable fats and oils, cornstarch, straw, wood chips, recycled food waste, etc. Both properties, however, and this is very important, should not be mixed up. If something, for example, is bio-based, it doesn't necessarily biodegrade, and vice versa. If something is biodegradable, it doesn't have to be bio-based. It must be very clear as well that it is not our intention to simply substitute fossil plastics with bioplastics, and we are not promoting the idea that bioplastics are the magic solution to littering. A holistic approach is needed, indeed, to tackle this plastic challenge, one in which the consumer also plays an equally important role. And here, educational proper disposal of waste starts as early as possible, even in childhood. Bioplastics will not be the solution for the large plastic waste patches in the oceans, for example. However, they can be a sustainable alternative to conventional plastics if waste and disposal infrastructures are adapted to bioplastics. Success for bioplastics is nevertheless largely dependent on political and public backing. And here is to respond to the question of today's webinar, where the EU support is needed. We expect from the EU, as mentioned earlier, to deliver an appropriate policy framework for bio-based, biodegradable and compostable plastics. It should be fit for purpose, and it should capture also the potential for innovation and the economic, environmental, and social sustainable benefits of bioplastics for the European Union. Lastly, in line with the overarching principle of the European Green Deal for climate neutrality by 2050, we consider that the benefits of using renewable resources for plastic manufacturing need to be reflected in the introduction of incentives for biomass. In this sense, we need strong policies, we need research, we need development investments, and financial incentives. These financial incentives, they can help strengthen the bioplastics industry. This should be done in a manner that would be equivalent to the promotion of recycled content with regards to financial measures. To sum up, a lot of very interesting topics have been mentioned today by different speakers. Indeed, we need a holistic approach. Policy development is ongoing, and we will see a lot of initiatives from the Commission in the coming months. We also are calling for evidence-based policymaking, and we're also calling for dialogue in order to include all the relevant stakeholders around the discussion table. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your remarks, Maria, and indeed for elaborating more on the prospects when it comes to alternatives to conventional plastics. And yes, so now to structure the time we are left for the discussion, we have received a number of questions from the participants, and I would be happy to pick on some of them and direct them to particular speaker or a number of speakers. But of course, happy to hear from you any additional reflections on what other speakers have said already. So then if you have something to add, please do just simply jump in and provide your comments or raise your hand. But on top of the questions that I will be going through from the participants, there is of course one, let's say, general question I would have more or less for everyone is any reflections, any concerns, any expectations you have when it comes to the, let's say, existing and upcoming impacts of the Russian invasion of Ukraine that it will have for the plastics sector and this, let's say, green transition in the area, how that can impact it. For example, we discussed how the plastic sector is dependent on the oil markets, for example, and this is related to the existing crisis. And in a way, what happened as not only this sector, of course, but more generally is a game changer. Of course, this is something that I guess needs to be reflected again, how these impacts will have on our transition towards more sustainable plastics and alternatives to it as well. So maybe I can come back first to Emmanuelle and hearing from, after we heard from all of the speakers, different concerns. Of course, if you have any general reflections, something that you want to respond to in particular to what we heard from, please do so. But then again, let's say, any early comments or projections you can say when it comes to the impacts of the Russian invasion on Ukraine, that's another thing. And then I would pick on, let's say, 2 points raised by our participants. One is about this contradiction, so to say, between developing focusing on recycling of plastics while then pushing to use for less plastics in products, for example. And this also builds on what Delphine mentioned. In a way, I feel that there is a sort of a tension between trying to reduce plastics or to keep them more in the economy, but then focusing on the recycling industry. There could be a potential contradiction. And this specific question is also to some extent related to another question I wanted to just pick on, which is on the role of the chemical recycling in the future. So what we said so far, when we move on to the recycling when it's necessary, do you have any additional points to share when it comes to the chemical recycling? I mean, I just a number of questions, but whatever you can provide, that would be great. But just we don't have a lot of time, so happy to hear what you can say on these topics.
Yes, no, I mean, our commissioner, the commissioner for the environment, oceans and fisheries, Commissioner Sinkevicius, is really involved in what's going on in Ukraine. He would say emotionally involved. He's been there. He's maintaining strong links with the Minister for the Environment there, and thinking on how we can support in any ways. It's a disaster. It's a disaster for human life. It's a disaster for the country. He's been reporting to us as what he saw in terms of the contamination due to the use of military products, the whole waste management system, the drinking water system for people. The amount of waste, it's a country being destroyed. So we feel that very much from him, also for us in DG Environment. And obviously, everything that can be done for pushing for renewables, energy efficiency, emissions reduction, is absolutely central. So I think that the whole situation just reinforces still the need for a circular economy and for the Green Deal. And I think the energy sector is mobilized also to find solutions as soon as possible. And the top leaders. I mean, you have seen also the meeting last week of the European Council, 27 heads of state reflecting upon how to cut our dependency to Russia by 27. So it's very much present, and for us it's another reason to accelerate our efforts. And obviously, plastics is also part of the equation. With the oil price going up, this may provide also an incentive for recycled feedstock, because I think that our colleagues from the European Investment Bank recalled it that one of the main obstacles is the price differential between virgin oil and then what we the recycled content. So there we see that, in this sad environment, maybe there will be additional incentives to reduce and also to produce from other materials. Also, to come back on the discussions, I think that the remarks from Delphine on the emphasis to be placed on the system is absolutely essential. I mean, keeping this system approach to the value chain is absolutely necessary. No one can fix it. It's an issue of being together in that endeavor. And again, I think the Circular Plastics Alliance in that context also is a very good initiative to show the way. The emphasis placed on the design, how you design products with the end of life in mind is absolutely essential. Driving down usage is critical as well. Obviously, a key issue that comes back very often as well in the debate and in today's debate is the use of chemical recycling, and there our thinking has been evolving in the European Commission. So we see that chemical recycling may be a solution to complement mechanical recycling, especially for hard to recycle materials. But I think that everybody in the business is aware of the energy intensity of chemical recycling. So there the issue is, you know, how to make sure that it is more beneficial than using virgin oil. So there again, the comparisons are extremely important in that respect. And treating, I mean, recycling into new fuel cannot be considered as recycling. I mean, this is also very, very clear. And so work needs to continue on that matter. Again, it's new technologies, not yet fully deployed at industrial level, and some caution needs to be taken in relation to the energy needed in these processes. Thank you, Stefan.
Thank you so much, Emmanuelle, for your responses to this, and indeed for pointing out that indeed more needs to be done to address these different points in the life cycle, and to keep in mind the prospects as well as potential also other effects on new technologies for treatment of plastics, and indeed that we need to keep in mind now a closer look on what will be the effects, the overall effects of the unfortunate and tragic developments in Ukraine due to the Russian invasion, and more specifically, I guess, more closer to our topic, then it will have effects on different sectors, but also on the topic we discussed today. And Paulina, I would have a somewhat similar question for you, but then more from, let's say, the financial, looking at it from let's say, financial design, financial planning, and supporting the say the green transition in the plastic sector. You discussed the preliminary findings of the research, but then how do you have any, let's say, estimations, any ways how you currently consider the effects of the Russian invasion on Ukraine, and how that affect different sectors, and maybe if you have any reflections on the plastic sector in particular, but also what also already discussed with Emmanuelle, how do you in a way consider these different stages of the life cycle and the entire value chain, how to finance the transition to the sustainable, greater sustainability in a best possible way, given the complexity, the different sectors used where the plastics can be used, given there are different stages in the life cycle that we want to design better plastics, use it, and then recycle it if no other options are available. How does basically DIB look at this, and how to ensure that the money is used in the best possible way to enable this transition?
Thank you, Stefan. Let me maybe start by saying that if I can say one key finding of the work that we have done so far, it is the complexity of the challenge, the complexity of the value chain, the interconnected stakeholders, or actually not in some cases not connected properly stakeholders, and so many different aspects of the problem that keep on popping up from each side. It's very hard to provide a straight answer, or to say, okay, we just, we build more recycling facilities, or we go into chemical recycling, and that's the magical bullet. There is no magical solution. Of course, we are looking at chemical recycling. We are looking at bio-based plastics, and none of those solutions appear to be those magical solutions that will turn everything around. So indeed, what is also needed is the systemic approach to a circular economy, and also financial support for innovative business models, which are by definition already circular. And the bank is doing a lot of investments into various circular types of business models and innovative solutions to this end. So I think the key takeaway for me is indeed that we have to continue working together across the board, the various stakeholders, industry associations, policymakers as well as the financial sector to find some solutions to this problem, which is not going away, because we cannot recycle our way out of the problem. We cannot export our way out of the problem, which I think Tobias also mentioned at the beginning. And the projections, at least before the war, were indeed for the amount of generated plastic waste to continue growing. So the problem is here to stay with us. So I think if I can summarize a little bit, my takeaway from today's discussion is really the need to bring the actors of the different parts of the value chain, as well as the policymakers, around one table, and to look at adapting this kind of systemic value chain integration approach so we can find solutions together.
Thank you. Thank you, Paulina, for your intervention on this. And Delphine, maybe we can hear from you also a similar question, how any reflections you have on potential impacts of the Russian invasion when it comes to the green transition in the plastics sector. Maybe we can start from that. And there is also another question on the global, you answered a couple of them already in written form. If you, for the broader, for other participants, if you would like maybe any highlights as to your written questions so that can be of relevance to everyone, you can also use this opportunity to reflect on that. There is another question that I can maybe that I can pose after a bit later. So yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think what's happening right now with the Russian invasion and the impact it has on the oil and gas sector is really showing that as long as we don't have like strong policies to reduce the demand and redesign the systems, the impacts are just going to be displaced. So what's happening now is that the gas and oil that we're not getting from Russia, or that we're trying to really not get from Russia, we're going to go look for it somewhere else. And the US and Europe just cut a deal to import more fracked gas from the US to Europe. Well, it's precisely something that in Europe we have said, no, we don't want to do fracking because of the impacts on the environment and on the people around. But in this context, we are massively opening our LNG terminals to frack gas from the US to create independence from Russian gas and oil. So there is no such thing as independent from oil and gas. We don't have much oil and gas in Europe, except for maybe Norway. So that's another example, like the way the pandemic showed us that our logistic chains, our supply chain for food are not resilient. This is another opportunity to realize that we're not resilient. And as long as we're not working on reducing the consumption and really working on resource efficiency, we are going to rely on the rest of the world for our oil and gas, for our waste, because we're still exporting massively our waste outside Europe, or even within the borders of Europe, the rich countries export to the poor countries, and so on and so forth. So I think there is a real, again, a real opportunity to look at our resource consumption and just like, if something, so for example, I heard how to recycle plastic. If something is hard to recycle, it should not be put on the market. It's as simple as that. It's not about finding solutions for this kind of packaging at the end of life. It's about identifying this packaging even before they're put on the market and saying through the EPR systems and a system of bonus malus, saying, no, your packaging is not recyclable, not easily recyclable within the conditions that we have right now, with the infrastructure that we have right now. So you are not allowed to put it on the market or even to produce it in the first place. So like, we need to stop like walking on our hands a little bit. Like starting with the end. We need to start with the beginning. And that's very important. And there is a tension. Yeah, there is a tension between reducing consumption and increasing recycling, because recycling to be viable will need constant, homogeneous quality, non-toxicity, and volumes to be viable. The same way there is a tension for me between the industry working on improving recycling and us trying to prevent production, because their system relies on producing, and that's how they make money. So there is a tension here, and we need to face it. We need to call the elephant in the room. So when I hear about the Circular Plastic Alliance being one of the echo chamber that the Commission is looking at for some decisions, I'm not sure we're going in the right direction. NGOs are not invited in the technical discussions at the Circular Plastic Alliance. They actually have been almost kicked out. They wanted to participate and the industry said no. Not everybody, some people said yes, but the majority said no. So how are we intending to change the system if not all parts of the system are around the table? And it's not only just us, it's trade unions, it's representative of marginalized communities, homeless people, refugees, single parents, people with disability, Roma people, like all parts of society. How can we start a transition if we keep talking amongst ourselves, white, educated people, middle class, upper middle class, most of the time, from Western Europe for a lot of us, I think, here. So I think there is much more to this conversation. But then again, coming back to Ukraine, what we've seen so far in any challenges that we face with plastic is just a displacement of impacts. We have displaced the impacts from marginal impacts from fossil fuel based plastic to bio-based plastic, putting pressure on land use, water, pesticide use, fertilizers, deforestation, because a lot of the feedstock massively comes from Brazil. This is displaced impact. Today, what we hear from Ukraine, the situation there in Russia, because of how massively they used to provide wheat to the rest of the world, is like, we need to pose the farm to fork strategy and push on fertilizers. Fertilizers are petrochemicals. They come from the same sources. They're usually from the same companies. This is a whole integrated system. So when petrochemicals are not going to go to chemicals and plastic, they're going to go to fertilizers and pesticides. So as long as we're not asking ourselves the right questions at the very start, before we produce, we're just going to keep displacing the impacts from a sector to the other, from a country to the other, from a continent to the other, from a marginalized population to the other.
Thanks for a reaction to this, Delphine. And indeed, I mean, the crisis as such shouldn't have happened. And there is, of course, a greater humanitarian aspect to consider. What is another point to make, I guess, is also that once the crisis is there, there is another problem that then the problem is, the existing problems are being further exacerbated, or they are not being used. It's not, we don't see a potential way to overcome certain problems, and coming back to similar situations we have with the Corona crisis, that once we have a crisis, it can be used to maybe overcome certain challenges, since we couldn't avoid the crisis in the first place. But yeah, thank you for your comments. And yes, Maria, I wanted to anyways to give you and Carolina floor to comment on also on the impacts of Russian invasion, but also let's say any additional messages on in terms of policies that you would need to support your efforts to support the green transition in the plastic sector, or the alternatives to plastics. But indeed, we have, let's say 11 minutes left. So now we would need to limit really our remaining interventions for you and other speakers.
Thank you very much. I will try to be very brief. So first on Ukraine, I was literally born at the border with Ukraine. So across my street was Ukrainian territory. Yes, I'm also impacted in an emotional way. Definitely, we knew we had an issue with dependency. Many years ago, I wrote my master thesis actually on the energy dependency, the EU and Russia relations, and also on geopolitics. And that was many years ago. And things in the meantime haven't changed much. So definitely that will have an impact on our sector, and that will have also a huge humanitarian impact without any doubt. I also wanted to mention something quickly on the land use for the production of bio-based plastics. So this has been indeed criticism which was brought to the taxonomy Climate Delegated Act by another NGO, and we took note of this concern. However, currently the production of bio-based or feedstock, which is used for bio-based plastics, only accounts to 0.7 million hectares, which is 0.1% of the total 5 billion hectares of agricultural production worldwide. So from our point of view, we do not consider that we are in direct competition with the production of food. And that's something that we have stressed to the Commission also in our communication with the different DGs. In terms of waste management, something that was mentioned before by different speakers, definitely that's something that needs to be improved. And also, as I stressed before, we think we need to speak also with the consumers, to have the consumers at the table, to really try to brainstorm on the best solutions, but also it has to do with behavior, with really teaching the best practices. So it's policy making, it's the industry, but it's also the consumers and the NGOs. And I fully agree with Delphine, NGOs need to be part of the discussion table. That's also very important. So I think it's really the time to, as someone mentioned also before, with crisis also comes opportunities. And I think this is an opportunity to drive forward the ambitions that we have as the EU in terms of really being climate neutral. I will stop because I know we only have 8 minutes.
Thanks.
So
thank you very much for your reaction. Very much appreciated. And Carolina, same to you. Any last quick reaction on the, let's say, it comes to the Russian invasion and let's say policies for the way forward from your perspective?
Yes, I want to echo some of the Maria's and many of yours. And I mean, of course, what is happening is completely a nonsense, you know. But I mean, apart from this, you know, I mean, what is taken from our industry, I fully agree. This is a tremendous opportunity to accelerate our energy ambitions to become carbon neutral as part of the Green Deal. And this has an impact as well on the industry. It has an impact, I mean, at the beginning of my intervention before, right? Like how we are decoupling our industry from fossil, right? Of course, we are a fossil base to the industry, but the future, fast forward, is we need to decouple that dependency, right? This is a tremendous opportunity to go faster and farther. It's a bat-driven cause to make us industrial, but it's a great opportunity to accelerate that in terms of making renewable energy sources more abundant in Europe, making them cheaper, right? Coming back with the kind of Paulina's discussions, how to make those alternatives most cost competitive. Otherwise, of course, the products will have an impact in the cost versus the current, right? You know, scenario. And also accelerate the circularity. Accelerate the circularity. Plastic waste is not anymore a waste. Plastic waste is a resource. Plastic waste is a resource. Today, I think Tobias was sharing data, around 40% of the plastic waste in Europe goes to incineration, average. 30% goes to landfill. This cannot be happening. This cannot be happening. There are better LCA solutions based on data, chemical recycling, mechanical recycling. This was a chat as well, post comments. Both are better alternatives versus any of them. From the LCA perspective, waste hierarchy principle, we should scale up both. One is not the solution for anything. Both of them are needed for making sure plastics circularity happens. And maybe my last point here is hard to recycle. Delphine, fully agree with you. That's why I was starting design for recyclability is the beginning of the journey, making sure that those polymers are compatible with recycling. But also let's make sure that what is not recycled today is going to be recycled tomorrow, because we are scaling up. Industry is investing to scale out those technologies to make sure that many of non-recycled easily today will be recyclable tomorrow. But fully agree with you, Delphine. This is the beginning of the journey, design for recyclability. So if it's not recyclable at the scale, in the medium term, 2030, this needs to be at the end stopped to be used, because this is impeding a circularity economy. This is our promise as an industry as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Carolina. Thank you. And Tobias, then also happy to hear from you on, let's say, any reflections you would have on the effects of the Russian invasion in Ukraine on the plastics sector and challenges, environmental climate challenges and ways to overcome them. There is also a more specific question, if you have anything to, on the, if there are any setups, laboratory hubs for testing soil samples across the EU that are accessible to different stakeholders, I guess, in terms of impacts of plastics of soil, I would suppose. So that's a bit more technical, if anything to add, but more generally, anything to, if you have any additional reflections on what was said so far, and also more specifically on the effects of the Russian invasion and how do you see it in terms of plastics?
Okay, thank you very much. I'll start with the more technical one. So yeah, it's true that soil is also, we talk about marine plastic pollution, but plastic is also contaminating soil. So some of the microorganisms, a lot of the microorganisms that we depend on for healthy soils are also being affected by microplastic and plastic pollution. There are some, and this is sort of an emerging field, so there's not a lot of studies on it. There is I know of just some studies here I'm based in Denmark, so at the Danish Technical University, they're having some soil testing laboratories where they're testing the effects of microplastics on soil. But I think this is an emerging field, and as we get more and more knowledge in this, I think there's definitely a demand for more knowledge on the impacts on soil. So hopefully this is something that's going to also be taken up in other countries. I think a lot has been said, a lot of on plastics in general, and I can see we're also running out of time. I just want to echo this. The idea that we really need to look upstream, we need to look at the design of plastics, we need to include all stakeholders when we're talking about how to transfer into a more sustainable plastic system. So a lot of good points have already been said. Yeah, the same on Ukraine. It's a very difficult issue. Of course, this is a catastrophe on a humanitarian level, also on a climate and environmental level. And again, it shows the sort of the need to scale up sustainable solutions, as they can also make us less vulnerable on these for these things happening. I think there was one point. Maybe I want to just, if I have time, yeah, just there was one point on sort of putting there's a contradiction between more recycling and using less plastics. I think there is a lot of plastic being produced. We're using a lot of plastics. I think even if we would use slightly less, there's still a huge market for recycled plastic. And I think if we use less and we use it more wisely, have a more high quality plastic, this creates a synergistic effect with recycling. So I don't see these things as a contradiction at all.
Thanks for, and I'd be happy to continue then the discussion and hear from everyone also. But indeed, we have only 3 minutes left. And I was also thinking that maybe Emmanuelle, you could provide a final, let's say, 1 minute reflection on anything what we heard, if you have anything else to add, because I'm sure that a number of both our speakers and participants would like to hear anything, like to say on top of what we heard already on what the Commission could do further.
Yeah, exactly. No, I saw many questions in the chat box regarding the packaging and packaging waste directive and what it will do. For me, it's difficult at this point in time to explain the content because we're still in the impact assessment process. So, and up to the adoption, this is quite sensitive. But again, it's a big piece of legislation because, and also it's very much related to the usage of plastic. So it will be an important file for us. Maybe also on bio-based and biodegradable plastics there. We have many different challenges. One of them is related to the information to the consumer. So because we speak about bioplastics and then it's not very clear what it is. We speak about biodegradable and you cannot say this is biodegradable because it depends not only on the material, but it depends on the environment in which it biodegrades. So, you know, the simple label biodegradable is really misleading. So there will be also more discussions on this in the context of the empowering consumers proposals of the Commission tomorrow as well. It's also clear that bio-based and the use of bio-based material needs to be related to the sustainability dimension. Even if the land use is not that much today, if it's growing fast, and then we need to make sure that we have certain conditions placed so that we give the right incentives. And my last message would be to call for contributions to combat microplastics pollution in the environment. Delphine today reminded us of the importance of different types of pollutions like pellets in ecocene. I think this is an important, to show the risks, but also to show what the industry is doing. And there, the plastics industry and all the converters, they are really committed to change the equation, even if it's not easy to commit all SMEs to make sure that they don't lose pellets in the environment. I think we need to continue that discussion, and all the contributions you can make on microplastics and what type of measures you would like to see, please contribute to the public consultation, which will be open until 17th of May. Again, microplastics are part of the equation. In the discussion on the global agreement on plastic, it was very clear that microplastics is also to be taken into account. So thanks a lot for that.
Thank you so much, Emmanuelle, for your final points on the matter. And indeed, I'm glad that you managed to cover so many topics on plastics in a relatively limited time frame, and would like to thank everyone for all your contributions, to all of the speakers and to participants for their active participation. And indeed, much more to be done, a lot of policy initiatives and other activities going on, but they need to match the scale of the challenge. And indeed, we need to look at the plastics holistically. We need to look at the entire value chain, and we need policies and right investments for the way forward. So thank you once again, and then looking forward to continue this discussion and future forums. Thank you once again. Have a nice afternoon.